So David is the founder and Chief Technology Officer of OpenLearning. Let's welcome him as he presents the role of social constructivism in the next generation of learning technologies.
Thank you. So good morning and a very warm welcome to everyone here. And thank you, Swee, for that lovely introduction. It's always wonderful to be here in Kuala Lumpur, and I'm very excited to get to meet every single one of you if I can, because I'm sure that many of you have come a very long way to be here. And also some of you from Malaysia. It's really good to see your faces once again. So before I begin, maybe I'll just tell you what this talk is going to be a bit like. It's the story of my journey to get here. I've already been introduced as the Chief Technology Officer, or sorry, Technology Officer, was it? That joke makes me very happy, thank you, Sue. But my journey into education technology actually started some time ago. So I have sort of three parts to this talk. There's this story and some of my reflections on my journey here. So also a little bit of show and tell about a place that I visited recently, and some thoughts about the future of online technology. So unsurprisingly, as a CTO, my university education started in computer science. And in computer science, I really enjoyed machine learning and artificial intelligence. But it was here as an undergraduate student that I had this somewhat unique opportunity. I found out that I could actually teach my own tutorial classes of about 15 to 20 fellow undergraduate students as a tutor or teaching assistant while I was still studying. So, where's our slide person? Oh, yep, there you go. There. So this is actually one of the labs in which I taught. So now, like most university teachers, I found myself in a teaching position with no formal education training and actually little understanding of what it meant to be an effective teacher. And also, like most university teachers, I did what was just most familiar. I started to teach the way that I had been taught. And this got me thinking. The way that I'd been taught, especially at university, had never really lived up to my expectations. So perhaps I could work out how I wished that I'd been taught and try that instead. Or perhaps my students each had a different set of experiences to me, and there was something that I could do to foster the best learning experiences for each of them. So I was actually given the permission to be a little bit experimental. And I took some time trying out some of the various ideas that I had in the classroom, but something actually dawned on me. By being a teacher at the same time as studying, I was actually consolidating my own knowledge by teaching. In fact, I think I was learning far more by teaching than I ever was by being in the role of a student. And this reflection, it actually really changed my perception of teaching. What I was experiencing in my own education was that the act of teachers teaching was a little bit at odds with the experience of learning. Most of the, where's that going? All right, thank you. The most exciting classroom moments were not when a student of mine or when I as a student was able to answer a question correctly. It was when ideas were bounced around the room. Everyone was contributing. We were all deeply engaged in the process of inspiring and teaching one another. We were learning together, and that passion was what was contagious. This is how my focus had changed, from how can I best teach to how can my students best learn. And as a teacher, I wanted to find out how I could provide the best conditions in which everyone could learn, because I was learning with them, and I wanted to create the best learning conditions for us to all learn together. And it's this insight from my earliest classroom teaching experiences that has really stuck with me. Too often, I feel that the effort put into trying to be a great teacher forgets to look at what helps students become great learners. So I finished my undergraduate, and I was working on research projects in machine learning, and machine learning is how computers can be essentially programmed to learn. And this is actually Adam and I at university writing artificial intelligence code on the university's RoboCup team. That's a team at the university where we programmed robots to play soccer autonomously all by themselves versus other robots in this international competition. And this is actually us competing in Suzhou in China. I'll come back to AI and machine learning at the end of the talk. It's fascinating stuff and it's a big game changer for education technology. But at this point in my life, I had actually become more passionate about how people learn. So I actually ventured into some education technology research groups at the university. In one case, I was building this virtual laboratory. It was here that I had another realization. From where I was standing, it seemed like the technologists that I was working with, the computer scientists, the software engineers building all the software, they weren't really thinking too deeply about education. It seemed to me that they were focusing on perhaps some of the wrong things. Much of the research that I was involved in treated people like empty vessels into which knowledge could be fed as input. It looked at how technology can sort of optimize these kinds of transactions. Now, this probably doesn't come as too much of a surprise since I was still within the computer science department. And when talking to computers, we're very concerned with this transactional input and output. But I was a little bit disappointed. None of what I had previously experienced as the most important aspects of learning was at all considered. People are not like our machine learning algorithms which diligently absorb all the information without question. We have our emotions, our relationships, this complex web of social influences that shapes everything that we do. It was the important parts, a caring environment, the opportunity to learn with one another, the sense of sharing and community. These were all neglected, or worse, not even considered to be important in the learning experience. But to me, this was the learning experience. To be an effective educator, it's not enough to just be an expert. You need to create an experience. So perhaps a little bit disenfranchised with my introduction into education technology, I started my own PhD project. I packed up and I actually moved over to the Faculty of Education to learn more about the surrounding body of academic education research. So for me, coming from the engineering faculty, Foucault had always been the French physicist, Léon Foucault, who measured the Earth's rotation with a pendulum. And that pendulum there was actually the Foucault's pendulum outside of the science lecture theatre at UNSW, where I was studying. But when I went over to the education faculty, I learned about qualitative education research and learned about a different Michel Foucault, who was a bit later and had some very powerful ideas about how knowledge is constructed within social and cultural practices. And these are the sorts of ideas that really started to resonate with me in my experience in my own teaching and learning. So this was kind of how I started my journey of educational enlightenment, as I feel it was. So this sort of discovering of the great educational theorists, such as Jean Piaget, Lev Vygotsky, John Dewey, Anne Brown. And I was really inspired with the likes of their contemporaries, people like Jean Lave and David Kolb, and of course felt a real affinity for the fellow computer scientists who had turned educationalists. Such as Etienne Wenger and Seymour Papert. So I'd finally found my way into all the academic discourse which supported those first feelings that I had when I started teaching. And usefully, it now had a name. It was seemingly referred to quite casually by the academic community as social constructivism. And social constructivism has its roots in Vygotsky, but has been shaped by all of the aforementioned and so many more. And this idea encompasses the whole learning experience rather than just how we instruct as teachers. It's the way we learn by creating artifacts in a social setting and how we share with one another and how that shapes our experience and it shapes the community of learners around us. So now this sort of bigger picture was crystallizing for me and could start to see how it all fit together. From Lave and Wenger's studies surrounding communities of practice to experiences like my own learning by teaching, or perhaps reciprocal teaching as it's called, by people like Anne-Marie Sullivan-Palinsar and Anne Brown. This was all this research and all this knowledge was really exciting and validating for me, but it was also a little bit sad, a little bit bittersweet, because how was it that for the last 100 years We've had so many brilliant minds exploring these ideas in the academic world, yet very little has practically made it into the classroom practice that I had experienced. With the exception of a very few brilliant and passionate educators who had found their own way, the vast majority of teachers, especially at university, are subject matter experts who are thrust into teaching rather than being trained educators. Furthermore, as a passionate technologist, even less seems to have made its way into any mainstream education technology which is designed to support and encourage such practices. So with a few rare exceptions, I'd already discovered that those building the majority of the education software were not really well informed and were just following the demands of the status quo. But I also wondered about the inverse. What do educators and education researchers think about technology? Do educationalists know what is possible? And the real issue here appeared to be agency. The best educators can only be creative within the limitations of the existing tools and spaces which they can use. And conversely, it is only the software engineers who can build the technology and the tools with ease. If we take, for example, the innovations in education technology of Seymour Papert, he built on the work of the pioneer of constructivist learning, Piaget. And Piaget himself once said, no one understands my ideas as well as Papert. But understanding alone does not create the impact. It was Papert's ability to build new technologies, to do something amazing with those ideas. It was his agency to be able to build new tools that led to the invention of Logo, perhaps one of the most well-known tools for teaching introductory computer programming. And it's a tool that I used when I was very young, and it was no small part in my own computing education. I think perhaps you, Adam, as well. Yeah. So it was perhaps the simplest but most inspirational insight to me. True innovation comes from the cross-disciplinary. To innovate in education technology, we need to closely study both education and technology together. So that was the beginning of my journey into education technology, or teachnology, as okay, that joke might be getting a bit old soon. So it's become my passion to continue innovating across these disciplines, taking social constructivist learning theory to inspire new technologies, and to try and see how we can create more effective environments in which we can learn together and foster thriving communities of practice. So I hope this sort of sets the stage for the rest of this talk. So speaking of setting the stage, I think I'd like to talk very literally about this stage on which I'm actually standing. So with the goal to create the best overall learning experience, it's actually the environment in which we learn and teach which I found to be really key. So we can start taking a look at our physical environment. We can take a look around this very room that we're in, and you can actually stand up if you like and take a look around if anyone is so inclined to get a better look at this space that we're in. What are all the architectural decisions that we can bring into question? How is this room set up to create a particular experience? And for me, the phrase "sage on the stage," you've probably heard it, springs to mind. This stage, this auditorium, the tiered seating, the acoustic design, the technology in the space, the projector, this lectern, the direction you're all sitting, the design of the lighting, where the entrance and exits are, every detail is working together in order to foster a very particular experience. It creates a very particular expectation. So look, you can even take a look here. I've got this whole moat between myself and you. And then past the moat, I've actually got a literal barrier. So in preparing this talk, like how Adam mentioned earlier, I was met with this sort of a particular sense of irony. I'm speaking here about being constructive and about being social and creating community and fostering interactive social learning, and yet I'm giving a talk on a stage in an auditorium. So even with the desire I am discouraged from doing so by the room and the design of it itself and the surrounding context and the surrounding expectation of being just an orator and giving a talk. And even though I invited you earlier to stand up, absolutely no one did. Because you didn't feel comfortable to do so in this environment. The other night I actually went and saw the Bohemian Rhapsody biopic about the band Queen. Has anyone seen it? Has anyone, show of hands, anyone seen that yet? Not yet. Okay, I won't spoil it for you, don't worry. But who knows the song We Will Rock You by Queen? Most of you, okay. So, in the film, Brian May, this is a scene from the film, he's the lead guitarist, and he demonstrates the beat. Does anyone know the beat? He claps and he stomps, he says, I want to give the audience something that they can perform. So who knows it? It goes like, yeah? You know the song, right. You can join in, absolutely, join in. Yeah, fantastic. So he says that he wants some active participation. He doesn't want this passive performer-audience relationship. He wants to give them something interactive. Queen are performing on a stage a bit like this, but they want something more than just an act. They want an experience. Having been a teacher in a lecture theatre, I felt so much sympathy in that moment. You're constrained into this expectation of the room. And you're constrained by the status quo of teaching practice and by the social expectation to just perform the act of teaching by the transmission of knowledge. There isn't really much encouragement for learners to be actively involved in the participation of their own learning. To do so is taking too much risk. So the question is, how does changing the room and changing the physical space actually change the learning and teaching experience? What could we do differently if we were allowed? So a little while ago, I visited Monash University's Clayton campus near Melbourne. I think I was with Shiri at the time. And I was lucky enough to get a tour of this building. This is the new Learning and Teaching building. They describe this building as a physical demonstration of Monash's commitment to education innovation. I had very high expectations, for it had just won this lengthy list of awards, both in architecture and the higher education awards, which we were in Melbourne for. You can read about this building and it says something along the lines of interactive lecture spaces using cutting-edge technology, enabling peer presentation, maximising participation, specialised computer, project-based learning, specifically configured to encourage group collaboration and all of this sort of thing. And you might forgive me for being a bit sceptical because I've heard a lot of similar rhetoric about many teaching spaces and so-called innovations, but when we see those innovations, do we really see a resulting transformation in teaching practices? So the real test for me wasn't what was enabled as a possibility in such a space, but what the space actively encouraged. And this actually might have been the first time for me that a space has actually lived up to the rhetoric and actually exceeded my expectations. I'll give you a quick look at what they've done with the place. So the first room that I was shown was this large, open, round space. It had clusters of tables for group work, each with their own small little screen, and it was showing the same thing as what was displayed on this big multi-directional display in the centre of the ceiling. And these screens were not designed to display lecture slides, or any teacher materials for that matter, but instead they were set up to demonstrate what the learners were doing with each other or wanted to showcase with the rest of the class. A class was actually running when I walked in, and the room was full of students, all collaborating and all chatting to each other. But it wasn't chaos, it wasn't loud, and I didn't actually feel conspicuous having a conversation with my tour guides in the midst of the learning environment, which I couldn't have done in a lecture theatre. The ring around the edge of the classroom is actually all whiteboards. It's for the students to work things out collaboratively and to teach one another. And that egg-shaped podium in the middle was being used by students to demonstrate a robotics construction to all the other groups on camera, broadcast all over all the screens. In fact, the cameras in the room could point at any table, whiteboard, or podium at any required moment. And this was all actively encouraging student sharing and the reciprocal teaching that I spoke of earlier. It was this sort of cross-disciplinary innovation of social constructivism, architecture and technology. Now you might ask, where does the teacher stand? So there isn't actually one particular place for the teacher to stand. The expectation is that the teacher is facilitating the learning process, not orating. The teacher can command the attention of the room from any point within it. They can direct the entire room's attention towards a particular student's challenge or exemplary efforts. The emphasis is on the interaction and the learning, but it doesn't detract from the act of teaching. It only gives it new possibilities. So these are the whiteboards around the walls. They're all actually angled upwards at a 4-degree angle. Does anyone want to guess why that might be the case? 4-degree angle upwards? Yeah, it's actually due to acoustics. It angles the sound away from everyone up into the high ceiling so that you can talk just as easily and project your voice across the room as with your neighbour while everyone else is still talking. And it felt like neither was particularly any more difficult than the other. This is another space. This one was perhaps a little bit more conventional at first glance. It looks a bit like a tiered lecture theatre, but there are actually some stark differences. Some things I'll point out. There are projected screens at the back of the room. The expectation is that the tables down the front are for facilitated student demonstration to the rest of the class, not just for lecturers. So the tiered lecture seating is still clustered around collaborative group work tables. And the podiums here are actually for student use, for presenting back, not for presenting out. It's a very interesting set of twists on the more familiar lecture theatre. And it's giving teachers the opportunity to start in a space which has some familiarity, but then readily invites them to imagine new possibilities and guides both the students and the teachers to more interactive, social and constructive behaviours. And the most remarkable thing about these rooms for me was not the individual elements that went into their construction and design, but it was how effectively it all came together. It all came together to give the right feeling for everyone inside. And it was really encouraging, and it really made for a comfortable and particular way of interacting. So my hope is that this is what we're seeing in the rise of education-led innovation in architecture and technology. It's the end of the era for a narrow imagining of technological applications which only service the education sector, and it's the rise of technology which is led by educational thinking combined with technological possibility. It's sort of education-first technology, if you like, and that's why I put the education really big and underlined. So the next generation of these large physical learning spaces is under transformation. The trend we can see is a move away from the conventional lecturing spaces designed for disseminating content towards spaces designed around interactive discourse. My interest, and what we do at OpenLearning, not quite yet, is perhaps more focused on how we innovate in online spaces more than physical spaces. But the same concept still applies. In the world of software, we borrow terminology from psychology and we call these affordances, the affordances of a virtual environment or online system. These are the design decisions, the clues, the cues, everything that comes together to encourage users to consider which actions to take. And it's the affordances in the online environment that instill the guiding principles for the user and nudge users towards particular actions over others. So who here among us remembers life before Facebook, Twitter, YouTube and Instagram and LinkedIn? Yeah? So this year, 2018, it has been dubbed the year of the digital native because it's the year that those born at the turn of the millennium turn 18. And for many, that's about the age you go to university. Our new university entrants have always had these technologies, and it's part of the social fabric of the world that they have grown up in. Facebook was launched in 2004. That's the year that I finished school and chose to study computer science at University of New South Wales. And for 18-year-olds starting university next year, they were just learning to walk and talk at that time. But let's take a look at the 90s as well, before social media became quite so ubiquitous. We can see actually a familiar trend. The earliest web pages, which were designed to disseminate, the earliest web pages here, they were sort of designed to disseminate information. The earliest search engines, like Yahoo and Google, and if you remember Alta Vista, these all came along to search for that content. And then we see Wikipedia. Wikipedia is interesting because it's not just about consuming content, but also about crowdsourcing and producing content. And this sort of star was born in the world of online content dissemination. And then what happened next in the 2000s for our now 18-year-old digital natives, that's over the course of their entire lives, that's the bit which I find interesting. With social media, online technologies have moved beyond content dissemination. Just like Monash has started moving beyond the lecturing format. These platforms are innovating with social technologies to create social online spaces. Just like the new learning and teaching building, these are spaces designed around they're designed particularly around social interactivity and social discourse. There's like a feed on Facebook or on Twitter or on LinkedIn or a Reddit thread or a YouTube channel. These are all the primary means by which we now consume content and media. It's no longer so much a website's content that we search for and visit. For better or worse, everything is embedded within social interaction and discourse, perhaps controlled by Facebook's AIs. But we'll get back to AI at the end. At OpenLearning, we're very interested in these phenomena because it means that we can innovate in educational spaces in a similar way to Monash were innovating in their physical spaces. To make online learning more socially constructive, they can be primarily designed around interactive discourse rather than content dissemination. When we're creating these affordances in our own technology, we aim to not only encourage more social encouragement and connection, but like we see in all these trends, we make it the focus. If we look at more traditional online learning, it's still very much stuck in the mold of promoting passive content over interactive social connection. And we can talk about the traditional online forum. Forums are often a bit of an afterthought in online learning. They're sort of tacked on to support the content delivery. The affordances of these spaces, they're set up to sort of encourage that transactional input and output again. They have the expectations that asking questions will be answered by experts, or that spaces, their sort of spaces are a little bit scary with pressure to say something astute or insightful or of particular note. I actually find these forums to sometimes be very high stakes environments. Like asking a question or answering a question in a large lecture hall like this, with all your peers and mentors staring at you. Without a lot of additional facilitation effort, it's not really a collaborative space that encourages incidental connection. It's not like the interactive spaces at Monash which foster the casual group conversation required to build effective learning relationships with both fellow students and mentors. So I like to explore the question, how do we reimagine the online space and put social interaction first? The way the LMS is often used is perhaps the online equivalent of the sage on the stage, with the optional Q&A sort of tacked on. Like this room, the affordances are set up to encourage and optimize that particular kind of online delivery. What if we could create an online learning environment where discourse is actually a first-class citizen? There are two parts to this that I've found myself focusing on. If we look at the rooms at Monash, as soon as a student walks into one of their rooms, their expectations change for what the learning experience is going to be like. So my first thought is, what can we learn from social media platforms, put through the lens of our education-first educational goals, to redesign the online space to have more social presence and more interaction for the learners? And similarly, as a teacher, walking into one of those rooms, the expectations surrounding your method of teaching are challenged and given new possibilities. So the second thought is, what affordances can we provide in an online platform such that our teachers can be more creative in designing social learning activities? So in some discussions with colleagues who also study learning sciences, I came across this very simple but very insightful Icap Framework by Mickey Chi and Ruth Wiley, and this really resonated for me because it's a really simple way to illustrate the sorts of experiences that we might want to encourage. So, P is for passive. This is in this context, a passive experience is one where a learner tries to read, listen, watch, or otherwise receive or absorb and store information. A is for active. Active experiences are where the learner takes an action, activates some stored knowledge, for example, taking notes or answering questions, or otherwise sort of manipulating the content. C is for cookie. C is for constructive, where the learner creates or synthesizes or infers or generates new information. For example, a creative task, building something, designing, comparing, contrasting, or otherwise generating insights and reflections. And I is the interactive. This is the socially interactive. They're involved in social interaction with others, sharing, co-creating, co-inferring, co-elaborating, co-expressing themselves. As a teacher, I'm always thinking, where are my efforts best spent? If we're just creating passive content for online learning, such as videos or PDFs, it's actually quite hard. We're competing with the whole of YouTube and probably Khan Academy and anything else your students will get from Professor Google. Your efforts are probably better spent curating that content, or if you are creating new content, perhaps the best passive content you can produce is that which promotes, invites, or stimulates action creation and social interaction and social exchange within the online community. Active experiences that I see online are most often in the form of a quiz or some sort of correction-based activity. And the issue I experience with this kind of activity is that everyone is trying to get to the same place, that some predetermined successful endpoint. In this kind of setting, it's difficult to capture some of that learning process. It's difficult to see the learner demonstrating learner. We only really see them demonstrate a proficiency. And if we take a bit of a leaf out of the situated learning book, there's a good chance that you're only really demonstrating how good your students are at taking quizzes, rather than the ability to transfer that knowledge into other applications. So there's a bit of a danger there. But also, with everyone trying to get to the same answer in some way, it leaves very little to discuss with one another. Any discussion is once again transactional. It's targeted towards a question or a desired outcome. The other two, however, they give us some very interesting opportunities for education technology. By contrast to the bottom two, which are more about convergence and more predetermined, when you're being constructive, it means that there is more of an opportunity for divergence and diversity. This might be a learner sharing an idea or capturing their reflections, and if a learner puts a bit of themselves in there, then there's a real opportunity to foster rich contributions, where your learners are engaging in self-expression and become a community of learners. I think there's probably also pretty clear alignment here to things like Bloom's taxonomy and that sort of thing. How are we going for time, by the way? Where's my timekeeper?
You have time. All good.
Fantastic. I might actually then run you through a few examples which come to mind from some of the things that we've done at OpenLearning in the past. So we can go top down or bottom up in this process. Passive content that we talked about before, we can actually have it as stimulus. We were doing this code of conduct course for elite athletes in an athlete introduction program, and the original content that these athletes were working with was more of a sort of a compliance exercise, where they were just being told what their code of conduct was and saying that they understood it. But we wanted something transformational. I remember that one of our learning designers put together a little activity where we took this high production trailer for a film, 7 Days in Hell. Has anyone seen that film? I don't think anyone has. I think it went like straight to video or something. But but it has Andy Samberg and other people all carrying on. And it's a comedy film where they're playing a Wimbledon tennis match that takes 7 days, and people are acting out, throwing their rackets around, knocking people out with the ball. It's all chaos. And this is already a high production piece of work. It's already designed around engaging people because it's a film trailer. Whether or not that worked for the film, we can bring into question. But in this situation, this was stimulus for the students to interact with one another. This was them saying, how does this compare to your code of conduct? Can you find all the different violations of your code of conduct in this film? And can you apply that to your own sport, for example, maybe kayaking, and then show how that maybe is different or relates to other people's experiences? Similarly, if we're looking at the way that we can create content to stimulate activity, there was an electrical engineering course that I remember where we had two teachers discussing in front of a whiteboard, like a light board actually, is the online equivalent of a whiteboard, I guess. They were role modelling a conversation. They were talking about an equation, they were doing an analysis together, they were making mistakes and correcting one another, and they wanted to show students how to have conversations around equations and how to solve them together. It wasn't about how to solve the equation, it was about how to interact. And then the online discourse that followed was modelling that behaviour and being able to interact with one another with equations. But we can also push the active ones up as well. I saw Andy here earlier. Your hand up, Andy. Andy Blands? Where are you? Oh, over there. Right. So I'll pull one of the examples that we did together. Multiple choice quizzes. But these are quizzes where instead of answering the question, the students are creating the questions. And they're creating their own quizzes, they're sharing them with one another, they're reviewing and rating each other's questions with a rubric, correctness, useful, difficulty, or something like that. And there was a bit of a hall of fame as well, and the most useful and popular contributions were showcased each week and this sort of thing. So even if we're taking something as banal as a quiz, we can still make it socially constructive. But the current work that I'm looking at is perhaps more top-down. It's more about how can we create social simulations online, or role plays, or this sort of thing, where we can actually start by thinking about the best way to create constructive and interactive experiences. So we're really looking at sort of ways to create this online environment which encourages teachers to create all these kinds of activities, which makes social interaction the core and of the online experience. It's not just an add-on, because these add-ons often get misused, but we want to look at the affordances which encourage learners to build rich communities of practice, and those which help teachers facilitate those interactions, and those which encourage learners to build these socially interactive activities to design the most engaging online learning experiences. So now, right back at the beginning, I said that I'd get back to talking a bit about artificial intelligence. So AI is my other passion. And from a technology perspective, out of all the emerging technologies that I can see at the moment, it's perhaps the most interesting to me as the most widely applicable. So far this year, we've only perhaps really seen AI popularised in education products as chatbots. But I think that there is so much more that we can do and so many opportunities for AI, especially since the goal for us is to increase social interaction between living people rather than just robots. So AI's power is to better understand data. Machine learning algorithms can look at a matrix of numeric pixel values in an image and output a description of that image. So for example, if I go to the next slide, oh, maybe we don't have that slide, okay. However, you can go to you can actually go to Microsoft's cognitive services and type in, or actually upload an image of a cat sitting on a table, and it will say, I think that that's a cat sitting on a wooden table. So it takes the pixel data from the image, puts it through its machine learning algorithm, and actually gives you a semantic understanding of that data. So what we are now looking at is whether that same kind of power can be used to look across all the artifacts and discourse created within an online community. Imagine if your course was built to capture as much as possible about how your learners were learning, and you could read every piece of work and every comment and every shared post and every contribution made by everyone in your course, all in a second, every second. Imagine the insights that you'd be able to gain. This is the sort of thing that we're looking into as a next generation technology. A technology that can say, I think that these are the students who are lonely and have no one to work with, or I think that this activity can be improved to promote more social interaction, or I think that this is how you could encourage these learners to be more active community contributors. or, as you might see later today in our product launch, ways to promote your students and showcase that which they have constructed, shared, and demonstrated that they can do. But you can only do all of this if you're collecting the right data. This is data which contains somewhere inside all of it the right information, information which differentiates learners from one another and shows you what they have created or how they have interacted. It's not useful to see just how well you've lined them all up in a row and put them on the same production line and fed them into the same exam. We need the social constructivist data. So AI is also looking to be very disruptive. You've probably no doubt heard that it's changing how we talk about the future of work. The fourth industrial revolution, as we're starting to hear it called, or my favourite name for it, Industry 4.0. What if I told you that AI will likely be able to answer any quiz better than any human? It's even likely that computers can learn new information just by watching our videos that we have plenty of. What we're going to have a much harder time teaching computers is how to be compassionate, how to care for each other, how to be creative, how to be nuanced, how to be innovative and how to be insightful, how to be an emotional and social human. Human skills are social skills, and to teach those, we really need the next generation of learning technologies to be social technologies. These are technologies that let us imagine new spaces, both physical and online, where we can very comfortably engage in social teaching and social learning. And now, perhaps a little ironically, I'll open up for question and answer. So thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, David. It's amazing what is possible with technology and good design. Thank you for showing us how virtual and non-virtual environments can shape our learning and teaching practices. So now let's take some questions for David, starting with Slido. Alright, so David, which question would you like to answer? So the most popular question is the first one, and followed by the rest. Let's take like 2 questions, and then questions from the floor.
Alright, so can classrooms be entirely socially constructivist? Who asked this question, if you wish to not remain anonymous? Anyone? No. Okay, so I'm going to just assume that this is everyone asking. Do they have to be entirely socially constructivist? I think that we see a lot of classrooms that have been in this traditional mould of really being designed towards this sage on the stage or lecturing or content dissemination mode of teaching. And it's time to try a whole bunch of new things. And I would strongly encourage everyone to try something more socially constructivist in what they do in their teaching practice. But I think it really comes down to you as a teacher and your own experimentation, what you want to try and do as to how you want to teach. And perhaps I can inspire you and influence you to try something and innovate something new. So I'm going to maybe step around that one a little bit and say that, look, I don't think they have to be entirely socially constructivist. I think there's lots of wonderful, diverse learning theories and ideas out there, but it's definitely one I would suggest trying out. So online learning isn't as effective as physical classroom learning because the teachers might not be fully engaged. I could also say probably very much the same thing about physical classroom learning, right? I've learned online via my own self-directed or self-determined learning, and I've found that I've been very engaged in my online learning, And I've had classrooms where I've just fallen asleep, where I just have not taken anything in whatsoever. So I would challenge this and say, efficacy of learning is probably not so closely tied to the medium, but tied to the experience that you're creating. And you can create wonderful experiences face-to-face, and you can create wonderful experiences online. And I would really like to get you to think about how one augments the other. Not how, for example, online learning is perhaps more or less effective than face-to-face learning, but how you can use new technologies and use new ways of doing things to make a better overall learning experience for your students. And any others that are... Translate face-to-face to social interaction online. Emerging tech like AR, VR. AR and VR is an interesting one. So I think that AR and VR technologies, they have a lot of hype at the moment as an emerging technology. They're one of the big buzzwords like AI, Internet of Things, cloud computing, etc. AR and VR has a very interesting niche. It really helps with risk and cost. I think that that's where it really comes in. It's a bit like the virtual laboratories that I talked about before. If you want to create access to something like learning some hands-on activity within a mine, which is quite dangerous, and you want to have that experience before you go into the actual mine, or if you want to have some sort of simulation of a piece of equipment that's too expensive, or something which is both risky and expensive and doesn't have the access. And that's the real niche that AR/VR looks into. I think that in terms of creating a learning experience, though, there's a whole host of technologies that we can look at. Have MOOCs lived up to their promise given completion rates as being very low? Who asked that one? Okay, so there's a whole interesting world of MOOCs out there. I think that when we look at MOOCs, we can see that there's this spectrum of perhaps the very first MOOC was actually a connectivist MOOC, or as the first time I heard the term, it was a connectivist MOOC. It was Stephen Downes and George Siemens. Is that, get that right? And this connectivist MOOC was really about running something completely online through social media where we're just connecting people together and creating your own communities and amongst your own friends and this sort of thing. And it's really self-determined as to how you want to engage with this kind of thing. So in that setting, MOOCs had absolutely nothing to do with completion. It was really just about having fun, about learning for the sake of learning. It wasn't even outcomes driven. MOOCs have then sort of evolved right to the other end of the spectrum, to perhaps the Stanford AI MOOC is a good example, where it's really just about let's put all the content online and get you to do it, and it's very sort of instructivist in its delivery. So that's a completely different kind of MOOC. You know, that's something which is built into a very instructivist platform, and it's built around like a different set of ideas. And in order to complete that MOOC, you have to be quite determined to get through all of that content and to engage with it on your own. You have to be very, very driven to engage with that, I felt. But I think that there's a whole world in between. Yeah, and this is where I think that the social constructivist approach is really useful. It sort of really bridges that gap for a lot of institutions and for a lot of organizations. It sort of brings the access of connecting people together and being engaged with one another and having that fun, and mixes that with some of the structure and the facilitation and guided discovery and of perhaps a course. So I think that when we're looking at social constructivist MOOCs, we actually have really new opportunities for looking at how to improve attrition and looking at really increasing engagement. So I would say that watch the future, see what we can do with these social constructivist affordances with our platforms, with our new technologies, and I think that you'll find that we can be very engaging online.
All right, so
Is that
due to the interest of time, thank you so much for all your wonderful questions. But let's take just one more question.
One more?
Which question would you like to take, David?
There's quite a few here. What's right at the top? All right. I think facilitation is an interesting question. How do we prepare teachers in their new role as a facilitator? So, when teaching online, I feel that there's a few different roles that all come into play to make a great experience. One role is obviously the subject matter expert. The subject matter expert is often not someone who has the experience or skill at designing educational experiences or facilitating communities of practice. Sometimes they are, and that's wonderful, and you can wear multiple hats when you're designing a course if you can bring multiple skills to it. But a lot of the time the subject matter experts are just that. They are experts in their subject matter rather than good facilitators or good designers. So what I think we need to do is help them out, and that can be by, if they're enthusiastic about it, teaching them how to facilitate and how to design good courses, but also perhaps bringing in new skills to assist them as well. And we can make the subject matter expert a thought leader within the community, someone who we position as a particular community role, which has a particular purpose. But from my experience, sometimes the best facilitators are actually people who are closer to the demographic of your students themselves. So for example, someone who's just done the course, or someone who has just actually still remembers what it's like to learn this stuff. Because as subject matter experts, we kind of forget how we learnt it in the first place. It's been quite a while since we learnt it, and we've now sort of focused on a whole bunch of different ways of refining the skills that we have rather than remembering what it was like to learn it in the first place. So sometimes I find the best facilitators are actually those who have only just learnt it and still remember what that's like. And those can assist in the facilitation process. But also I think that another really important part of the whole process is the actual experience design itself. You can get quite far by having really good self-working course design, which helps promote facilitation automatically within the design of the mechanics and the experiences within an online environment. It's a bit like if you have an empty room and you put a whole bunch of people in it for a particular purpose, you'll need a facilitator to tell them what to do and to govern the interactions and to make some particular experience work. But if all those people also came into an empty room and there was a board game on the table with a bunch of well-designed mechanics and a well-designed game, then it's much more likely that those people will be able to work out how to have a similar experience by themselves. And if you combine the two together, then you might have an even better experience again. So the idea here is that there's multiple roles that can all work together, and there's bodies of knowledge that we can draw from to improve all these different aspects to the design and the delivery of effective online experiences. All right. Is that it?
Thank you so much, David.
Thank you very much.
A round of applause for David Collien. Love the questions that you guys post on our Slido. So for every keynote, there will be a Slido posted. Feel free to join in by typing in the keynote number, which will, of course, showcase before the keynote starts.